Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen and fellow environmentalists. Today we have a special interview with Mr. Akashambatwa Mbikusita-Lewanika. He is a Pan-African revolutionary, convener and founder of the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, and once upon a time National Secretary of the party, former cabinet minister and MP, former special political assistant to the president, that's President Rupia Banda, former managing director of Tazara, group director of projects for Indeco, community development activist, scholar, author, and prince in the Barotse land. Welcome to the interview, sir.
Thank you very, very much. You are welcome.
You're a prominent citizen in our country, a senior citizen. So we thought it's important to have this discussion with you and tap from your knowledge and wisdom. So to get the discussion started, you could probably share with us where you were born and what your education background was like, primary school, secondary school, and tertiary education.
Okay, thank you very much. I was born, the environment I was born in is a mining town. Okay. I was born in Musakile African Mine Workers Township. I say that because it was a segregated time. And I went to school. I started school there at Musakile Primary School for a few months. But shortly after that, I followed my brother, my eldest brother, who had started teaching at Munali, to Munali. So I continued with my primary school, sub A, B, standard 1 and 2, at Tunduya's school, which is just behind Munali Secondary School, from 54 to 58. Then went back to where my parents were working, which was in Kitwe, for my standard 3 and 4 at Kalela Primary School, and then came back again to the Lusaka area to do my standard 5 and 6 at Chalimbana Primary School, which was a teacher training college. So we are more or less like guinea pigs, which sometimes is a good thing, because when teachers are learning, they probably do a better job since they want to pass. So I went there. Then after that, I went to school in England at Bethany School. Bethany School was a school where my uncles, Lewanika, who became Litunga Imwiko the first, and his brother, Lubasi Wamuongo, went to school in 1901 in Kent. So 60 years later, I went to that same school to continue that tradition. And the interesting thing about the school is that in 1902, when King Lewanika went to England for the coronation of King Edward VIII, he found that King Edward VIII was not well, so the coronation was postponed. So he stayed in England for 6 months. And during that time, he also went to see his sons at Bethany School, where there is still a commemorative stone, which he unveiled to commemorate his visit there. I finished my secondary school there, did my O-levels and A-levels, then continued to polish up my A-levels and O-levels at the Oxford College of Further Education in Oxford, still in England, before going to the United States in 1967 to one of the historically black colleges and universities, Jackson State University in Mississippi, from 1967 to 70. I graduated in 1970 because I was also going to summer school, so I was able to do a 4-year program in slightly under 3 years because I was going to school during her. These were very interesting times, very important time. During my time in Mississippi, it was at the height of the civil rights struggle. In fact, I saw Martin Luther King, met Martin Luther King, And I was part of the students who were, and community in Jackson, who were ready to follow him to Memphis, where a few days after he visited us and addressed us, he was shot.
Oh.
So it was a very historical event, and it also gave me exposure to the civil rights movement, to the liberation movement. And one of the most interesting things about going to Mississippi at that time, to the United States at that time, during the Black Power era, was that as an African, I was looked at as an instant resource person about Africa, because people wanted to know about Africa. So I ended up having to read a lot about Africa in order not to disappoint them. So sometimes I feel even to date, I tend to know much more about the whole of Africa than I would have otherwise known. But this also prepared the ground that when I went to graduate school at Cornell University in New York, upstate New York, this was now the Ivy League type of university. So I had a chance to go to a black university, which I'm so happy and proud to have been, but also a chance to go to a traditionally mainstream Ivy League university like Cornell, where I did public administration as well as African studies and economic development. My thesis there was actually on the agricultural marketing boards and economic development challenges of Zambia. Among my teachers was Mr. J. Congress Mbata, who was one of the founders of the 1944 African National Congress Youth League, together with the Mandelas, with the Thabo Mbekis, not Thabo Mbeki, but Tambo, Oliver Tambo, and others like that. So that exposed me to that, but that also got me involved in Southern African liberation support movements. And while at Cornell, I was also president of the African Students Association and also vice president of the Pan-African Students Association of the Americas during that period. So it was a period of my deepest politicization process. After that, I went to Canada, where I did my second master's degree at Carleton University before coming back home and joining Indeco.
Okay.
So that was the first phase. I later also went back to university again, but that is phase one of my educational background.
Okay.
Yeah.
A very rich background.
Yes. I should also say that although I was born on the Copper Belt and the environment of a mining town, which you know also has environmental challenges from beginning to end. In fact, when we used to go back home, like coming from Lusaka school, going back home to Kitwe, when we smelled the sofa, we felt good. It smelled like home. We didn't know how dangerous it was. I think they used to call it center or something like that. We didn't know what it was. But in other words, we grew accustomed to growing in that polluted area. But although I was born in that environment, I was born into a family whose own background is from the Barosi cultural landscape, which has another environmental picture altogether. So you could say that I'm familiar with the challenges of the environment, both in the urban mining setup and also very attached to the environmental challenges in Barosi land.
Okay.
Yeah.
And talking about Barosi land, it's famous for its floodplains.
Yes.
And internationally and locally, you know, floods are always associated with disasters. But there's a unique relationship that Lozis have with the floods. They celebrate the floods. In fact, one of our famous traditional ceremonies is all about, you know, Boomboka.
Yes.
So could you just share with us what it's like, that relationship with the floods?
Yes, it's a very historical phenomenon, because it's almost identical to the cultural attitude in the Nile Delta, where you have the same canal system, the same culture of managing floods and using floods for transportation, for irrigation, and really befriending nature, so that it is unique in that sense, but also historical in the same sense that you see, it has a deep root, because our people, the Bantu people, basically can be traced depending on how far back you go to the Nile Valley, so that you could. There are other forces which led to migration southwards from that valley, and various groups moved at different times, and they moved in different groups and in different directions. So where the Barosi people, some of the Barosi people originate, they came through from the Nile Valley, went through a bit of Sudan, a bit of Chad, a bit of Cameroon, came down to what is now the Congo, passed through parts of Angola before settling back. So this is a long period of traveling. So that you can imagine, if you have a memory of the days, the good old days, it's like you are going back to nature, to your natural state. So in a sense, it's like the promised land that for over many centuries people were moving to. And in many ways, the Barosi Plain now becomes the center, because it's a reproduction of the Nile Valley environment and the Nile Valley culture. Because you notice that apart from Egypt and a few other places, in pre-European times, you don't get a place where indigenous Africans had elaborate canal systems, where they actually lived, enjoyed, and made the floodplain a centerpiece of that. But also the floodplain is not an isolated thing, it's not secluded. It is interlinked to the forest areas around it. In fact, if you look at Barosi land, there is the Great Barosi Plain, the biggest, but if you were to go up and picture it, you find that it is reproduced in smaller sizes all over the world, all over the country. And the same reproduction where you have a waterway like the river, then you have a plain, then you have forestry on both sides. It's reproduced everywhere. And so that the livelihood of the people and the political system of the people began to center on the plain, in the same way that in ancient times, the livelihood, governance, and cultural development of people, African people, the original African people of Egypt, had in the Nile Valley.
Okay. So, talking about its ecological significance, we know that the Royal Establishment and WWF as well have been pushing to have it recognized as a World Heritage Site. How far have we gone in achieving that goal?
You know, a goal can be good, but how you go about it is everything. What is most important is that the way the plain is, the way the European colonialists found it, means that the native Africans knew something about how to manage it. In fact, the threats to our land and natural resources has been accelerated with the introduction of European colonialism. And it has been doubly accelerated since independence. And even now it's still being accelerated with the management of resources taking place based on a governance system that I think does not fully appreciate, does not really take on board, and marginalizes those who have looked after the land and natural resources over 400 years since they went there. So the challenge, first and foremost, to me, declaring any part of Africa a natural heritage site is not the most critical aspect. What is important is to look after our land and natural resources. and to make sure that the indigenous people are in charge of that the way they have been all along. During colonialism and after colonialism, they have been marginalized. They've been disempowered to manage that thing. So that what's more important is that to ensure that you give back the powers of the indigenous systems and institutions to be in the driver's seat in the management of that plan. The second part, which is most important, is the livelihood of people. Because you see, the land and natural resources, it's a responsibility of people, and traditionally African indigenous people have taken this responsibility quite well. That you use it to live on it, but you also are custodians of it. So you both use it properly and look after it properly. Those responsibilities should be enhanced and utilized. Now that brings in the question of livelihood. In other words, it is not desirable that pieces of Africa should be museum pieces for others to come and wonder. I think you might have followed the argument over the San people in Botswana, where many European forces wanted us just leave them there so that we can come and visit authentic Africa. Meanwhile, in their own Europe, they've managed to keep their culture, to keep their historical buildings, and also modernize it. And there is nothing to stop Africans being able to modernize while maintaining our culture. And for instance, architecture, or even food that you find in a given community, it's not a permanent thing. It's dynamic. You may find that at one time the only building resources you have are reeds and mud. Yeah. Now it is a misdefinition of culture that because at a given time you find people living in mud huts, then you say that is their culture. Tom Mboya of Kenya, during the earlier years before independence of Kenya, said something I always remember, that sometimes tourists look at poor Africans who have made sandals out of discarded tires, and then they think that for a Maasai to wear that is his culture, and they don't want them to wear sandals of any kind because they are spoiling something. We don't want to fall into that bag. So that and in order to make sure that we don't fall into the bag where we allow ourselves to be just museum pieces, or to our resources to be museum pieces for others to come and enjoy, while our livelihood is not being maintained. So that is the other important aspect of it. The third most important thing is that the decision-making process must be consultative, genuinely consultative, and genuinely democratic, genuinely seek the voices of the indigenous people. The assumption that indigenous people know nothing is so ridiculous, because if they knew nothing, there would have been no landscape to come and watch, there would have been no animals to come and watch in Africa. So that it is very ridiculous and very insulting. And unfortunately, some of these insults are coming from ourselves. In other words, Africans are ruling Africa in third person, as if they are carrying out the white man's mission. And also disrespecting our culture, disrespecting our people, assuming that they know nothing. So the involvement of our people in the process of decision making is very, very critical. It should not be dictated from the top. And unfortunately, the governance system we adopted from colonialism, which has continued since independence, is a top-down type of management. So it's assumed that decisions are made in Lusaka, then you go out into the rural areas and tell the natives what the decision is. If they don't understand, they must be stupid, so you must sensitize them. Or even if they don't understand, you still must go ahead because you are a know-it-all. This is very detrimental. The third aspect is that, you see, this tourist business, you see, it can be a good thing, but it can also be very destructive. It's very disempowering to Africans. For instance, the Musotunya area is a World Heritage Site. In terms of livelihood, what is expected of our people is to be waiters and taxi drivers, dress up like miniature little Zulus, dance for white people outside their hotels. It should be more than that. In other words, you don't want to reproduce that model in Barotseland. We want, if there's going to be a World Heritage Site, its management must be in the hands of indigenous people. If the indigenous people need some special skills, then those skills should not be given to them in exchange for disempowering them. If there are skills that people don't have in order to manage this, then part of the plan is to ensure that there is, in future, they are trained to have those skills. So that the future, the vision of ours, is not a Barotse landscape, which tourists from Europe can come and enjoy, with natives remaining as native as white people want them to remain. It should be a landscape which celebrates Africanness, is driven by Africans, and out of which they earn a genuine livelihood. Yes, you can sell curios, fine, it's a little livelihood, but the land and natural resources of Barotseland is, yes, it has curios, it's part of our culture to have curios, art pieces, art crafts, but more than that, it feeds us. So that it must include animal husbandry, which is regenerative, must include crop growing, which is regenerative, it must include the management of the soil, and this is very critical. Because part of the disempowerment means that the structures, the African structures in our villages have been so dismembered that even cleanliness, even agricultural methods which they used to know, they are no longer practicing them. Instead of encouraging more natural agriculture, we are plastering them with chemical fertilizers, which are, even from an economic point of view, you can't have agricultural development in an African country like Zambia based on imported chemical fertilizer. One, is destructive to our soils. Two, it's economical. It means that our farmers are perpetually in debt. So that it has to include the livelihood of the people. Those, I think, are the issues that I'm very concerned that it is.